This is SSN
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Welcome to the Most Painful Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Hoppe. In the past, we've talked about the importance of strength training and how it can help improve the quality of life when you're suffering from chronic pain. A couple episodes ago, we had Leroy Ho, a physiotherapist, who talked about the science and the approach to strength training when you're living with chronic pain. Now, the military mindset of mission first, self last, and of course pushing through pain can have an impact on the approach a veteran takes to pain treatment. However, what if we use the military mindset to help increase strength and cardio and to build a tactical athlete? What does that mean? Today, we'll talk to Randy Turner, a former JTF2 assaulter, MMA competitor, and strength training coach. He's the owner and head coach of Direct Action located in Ottawa. Randy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. Randy, maybe we can just start first few minutes and just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the strength training, and then I guess we can talk about how it applies to veterans and I guess anybody.
Sure. Yeah. So I joined the Canadian Armed Forces right out of high school in 1998 and did basic training in Saint Jean, Richelieu, then went to Winnipeg where I was posted to the 2nd Battalion PPCLI, spent about 5 years there. And then I tried out for an organization called Joint Task Force 2. And I was part of the Joint Task Force 2 assaulter team from 2004 until 2019 when I retired from the Canadian Armed Forces. And in that journey, at the early stages, understanding, how conditioning was important for every day, doing your job every day, but also for the importance of, a mental release. I kind of was exposed to that relatively early, probably as a teenager before I even joined the military. I was exposed to, lifting weights, resistance training, and it was always just a part of my life. So I made training a routine, just like brushing my teeth. And as I got closer to the end of my military career, I saw, first I'll back up. There was components during my career where I suffered some pretty harsh injuries, a couple of knee surgeries, a couple of shoulder surgeries. And I believe that those could have been avoided had I had a different mindset and approach to training, where knowing now what I didn't necessarily know or want to know back then, I saw a need for understanding how to lift and how to move more efficiently to avoid those injuries. And then now that I'm, completely retired and providing training for others, I'm very cognizant of, what's the difference between, an injury and being sore or actually legitimately being hurt. And where does that mindset lie in terms of this is a time to rest and recover versus this is a time to push through and persevere.
Yeah. So Randy, I mean, obviously strength training, very important. And you did some training in that. And so how did you move from, I guess, the military side of it, getting into the strength training world and the coaching side?
So while I was still serving with Joint Task Force 2, I did suffer a couple of injuries that I was telling you about. And during the rehab and recovery phase, I built relationships with the strength and conditioning coaches and the physiotherapists at the unit and organization. And, we were very fortunate where we had a lot of expertise and a lot of true professionals to help us get back into the fight sooner. And, as those relationships were being built, I had an opportunity to ask a lot of questions and kind of get a deeper understanding of, the body, the anatomy of the way we move when we're under a specific load, movement through load carriage. And it spiked an interest inside me where I want to learn more. So I started to take personal training courses when I had some downtime or on my own time, just to develop my skills and knowledge a little bit more. And, as I became really interested in this stuff and I was getting close to retiring, I knew that there was a component of strength and conditioning that I would be interested in doing. And it was really with the help of a few mentors in the strength and conditioning world that helped guide my direction towards tactical athletic development. And, that's kind of the phrase or the angle that I like to take with the clients that I'm working with today, even if they're, a civilian, general public, school teacher, doctor, but they want to feel and move like a, special operations assaulter, for example, there is a lot of knowledge transfer that I garnished while I was in uniform that I now kind of mold or adapt it to that individual based on their desires and their goals.
Yeah. So basically you had the experience doing it hands on, and then you coupled that with the education to understand how things work. So
Yeah.
when you talk about, I want to go back to where you said you could have avoided the injuries through better training. What did you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. I kind of took the approach where if something wasn't feeling right, rather than acknowledging it early in terms of getting the professional help, physiotherapy, or, maybe having a strength and conditioning coach view the way that I'm moving and identify any limitations that I might have been, compensating for. Rather than taking that approach, I just found ways to train around it. And in some cases, it was beneficial because I was able to stay in the fight. In other cases, it made those injuries worse to the point where I became combat ineffective and I needed to get surgery to rectify those problems. So what I mean by that is I do believe had I addressed those issues earlier in my career, I don't know for sure. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do believe I could have avoided potentially those surgeries, or at least made those injuries a lot less and a little bit more manageable.
Yeah. So, I mean, that goes right back to the military mindset, right? Where you just kind of figure another way out and around the problem versus addressing it. And then years later, I guess that's why we have a lot of injuries in the military. Would you agree with that?
I think we do. And it's probably coupled with tempo, like operational tempo and training tempo. For an example, at the unit, it would not be uncommon for a lot of guys to say, man, I got a bum shoulder. I got to get it checked out. I'll do it after this next training iteration. And then they're on the road for 2 or 3 weeks. They come back and they might have a couple of days of downtime, but then they're right back into something else. And, maybe it's a fear of missing out, or, guys don't want to let their peers down, for example. So they just continue to push through that. And before you know it, 3 years goes by and they're still dealing with that same injury, and they're finding ways to compensate and overcome in order for them to stay in the stack and stay in the fight.
Yeah. And I guess that's just at different levels and different intensity levels throughout the forces. That's kind of the mentality. And of course, each subunit has their own culture that goes with it. But I think the common thing we always hear is we're just keep doing it and keep doing it till you can't do it anymore.
Yeah. And, I do believe, and like when I say this with caution, but I do believe it. That's why I feel like sharing it is I don't believe in overtraining. I don't think that's a thing. I do believe in under recovery, however. So like sometimes people will avoid that hard or intense session. We'll say not so much on the job. That's a little bit different. You've got to do what you got to do, whether it's in training or operations. But I'm saying in training, when guys have time and opportunity to go to the gym, that's what I'm talking about, where I do not believe in overtraining. I don't think that's a thing, but I do believe in under recovery. And maybe that's just semantics and wording, and, so be it. That's the way I choose to look at it. But why I say that is because, if we want to be combat effective and we want to perform optimally, we have to give ourselves time to recover. We have to allow the muscle fibers to recover and regenerate the way anything would be in terms of learning. Sometimes though, we will, continue to push because, that's what high performers do. And that's okay. I would say, yeah, that's good. You can find other ways to train around those injuries. So where I'm going with this is, rather than not training at all, just change the modality of the training or change the intensity of the training so you can still move and stay, active, but without aggravating or making that injury worse. So I truly believe in that. And I think that approach and that mindset needs to be practiced. It's not something that you can just do or not do. It's being aware of what's going on with the body and how can you, still do something, just being smarter about the training.
Yeah. And I think, when you look at a interdisciplinary pain clinic where, veterans aren't familiar with that, we do have a podcast on that in the first season that talks about the pros of going to an interdisciplinary pain clinic. And many times the veterans do well in those clinics, but one of the issues is that they're constantly pushing. So they hit the peaks and then they drop, right? Because they're not like you say, they're not doing the recovery time or pacing it out a bit. So, and I guess that would probably go for anybody. I mean, your experience, you're not just dealing with veterans, you're dealing with civilians too, right? In your profession now. And
exactly. Yeah. The profession now, we're providing services for predominantly law enforcement, a little bit of military, and then some general public. You kind of see a wide array of physical capabilities, athletic abilities, and movement patterns. And, what I notice very common with the demographic of folks that I'm training with is a lot of guys have tight hips and a lot of guys have tight lower backs. And sometimes they think the issue is in the hip or in the back, but understanding the body and how everything is connected, in some cases, it may be due to underdeveloped hamstrings, or it may be due to an injury in their rear delts that they haven't recognized or identified yet. So everything tends to be connected, but until we actually sit with a professional and literally do a complete diagnostics and have somebody say, you know what, I've identified that there is a underdevelopment here in your hamstring, which is causing an issue in your medial meniscus, and we can fix that. We can fix that before it becomes irreparable.
Yeah, and I think that's key, right? It's the same as I've been told too. You got low back pain sometimes just because your glutes aren't doing the job, and everything's quad dependent, right? Which a lot of us are. So let's go back to what the tactical athlete is and what that means in your business and with your clients, both. How do I put this? Because they're all civilians, both we'll say law enforcement and not law enforcement. I don't know how you want to frame your clients.
Sure.
So what does that mean, that tactical athlete?
Sure. So most of the civilians or general public who, they reach out and they're interested in doing this type of training, most of them have already done their research and they have a good idea what they're getting into. And the way that I formulate it for the individual is obviously based on their goals and desires. What are they trying to achieve? But what I'm very clear about is everything that I do with a strength and conditioning component has a combative interface. So, strength and conditioning for the combative athlete. So what that means is if we are going to get in a scrap, whether or not you're a law enforcement professional, a military professional, or general public, the consideration is with and without load. So if you have 60 pounds of gear on, for example, how we move is going to be a little bit different than if there's no equipment on. So I try to tailor it to the individual's, realities of what they need. And the tactical athlete in my opinion, is the ability to move our bodies well while under a bit of resistance from that load carriage. So a gun belt or a plate carrier, for example, is going to change the trajectory of how we move our bodies through certain ranges of motion. And a lot of what I provide for folks is generally like an hour session, for example. There would be usually 2 pull movements with a push movement and an anaerobic threshold power development. So in other words, we'll get the heart rate up. Oftentimes we'll do at least 2 pull movement patterns and with 1 push. So a 2-to-1 ratio is what we're after, because typically we do well, especially as young men, we do well with anything that's in the mirror. So anything in the front, pushing mechanisms we tend to be okay with. It's the pulling mechanism that sometimes is a little bit underdeveloped. And then with that, there's usually some sort of, transverse abdominal twist, right? So there's a movement pattern where it's not just a linear straight up and down. There's often a movement left or right. And the reason for that is that replicates what it's like to be in a scrap for real. So sometimes there's pushing, sometimes there's pulling. Heart rate will definitely be elevated. And then being able to move our body through those mechanisms while under, a little bit of load, maybe 60 pounds of gear.
So would that apply to somebody who's not getting into a scrap? How can,
Sure.
If you say you get a veteran that comes to you and he's just wanting to strengthen himself because he wants to get stronger, or he or she, and they're not going to be into law enforcement or, not going to be in that line of work. How can this help them?
Well, I would caution them first. I would say if you're no longer in uniform, you're not in the military, you're not in law enforcement anymore, and now you're looking for, sustainable energy and, just everyday quality of life. I would say we can still work together, but what I typically do is not designed for that person. And that's what I would say. I would say maybe I would recommend a personal trainer that is going to work exactly on what you want. So if you just want to get a little bit stronger with an Olympic lift, for example, then I would recommend that. And the reason that I say that is because even though the one, that individual may no longer be in uniform, well, they still run day-to-day errands. They still go to the grocery store. They still go to the bank, etc. In those transitions between home to vehicle to wherever that venue is, there is a legitimate risk of, somebody that's mentally unhealthy that's on the street. They decide to pick a scrap with you, or they're down on their luck and they try to rob you. The ability to fight to safety is the first and foremost of my thought process. So, I understand if people are working around injuries, and that's fine. We can work around that. That's no problem. But there's still a mindset of, if you have to defend yourself or your family, can you do that? And if not, then that's what I'm going to help you with.
Yeah. And I know we had talked originally there a few months ago about just some of the training methods, how to push the cognitive side by surprising or not knowing what the training is. And I know I've been there's some articles and research, I think it's out of California, that's looking at, they were saying if you're just sitting on a bike pedaling, yeah, that might be good for your brain, but actually what helps is if you're doing something like if you're walking and balancing and you're hiking, you're engaging both cardio and your brain actually has to work to keep you in balance. And I know you had mentioned you do a little bit of that, so maybe you can expand on that with your training.
Yeah, for sure. So typically when a client comes in to train with me, we've already built a rapport. We've had a conversation of what their goals are. And then when they come in, I'll have the plan for that session written out on a whiteboard. And as they come in, they can look at it. If there's certain movement patterns that they're not familiar with, we'll go through that as part of a active warm-up. So they'll go through that movement pattern so they can get comfortable in understanding how to kind of prime those muscle fibers that are about to be used for that session. And then we'll integrate it into the session. Sometimes the feedback that they give me, for an example, if they had a terrible sleep the night before, or if they went for, a 10K hike the night before, they may be fatigued already as they come into that session. So we'll adopt and change it a little bit. But where the cognitive side will come in is often with the sessions that I run for folks is there's a technical component on the mat. So some form of self-defense, which it's very technical. It's relatively slow. There are certain movement patterns that we're teaching. So it's a learning phase. And then to break it up, that would be maybe 3 to 5 minutes, for example. There'd be a technical phase. And then there would be a conditioning phase where we would ramp the heart rate up. So as they get their heart rate up, as they're recovering, so maybe that's another 3 to 5 minutes. And then as they're recovering, the active recovery would be another technical phase onto the mat. So there's constantly interchanging between technical learning and then a physical output. Now, depending on the feedback that they give me, depending on how well they're moving or any issues that they might be dealing with, the complexity of that physical piece may be dialed back a little bit so the intensity isn't overwhelming.
So if a veteran comes to you and says, hey, I want to get back into this again, but I'm struggling with some back injuries. I got this from service, but it's something I want to continue. This is good for mental health. I want to do this kind of work. How do you approach somebody like that? How do you help with their strength training, and how do you help with what you do?
So, with a little bit of feedback from them, if they had a back issue, an ankle issue, wrist issue, whatever that might be, first we identify that. And then as we go through the movement patterns, I would expect and ask them to give me feedback. So this will be the movement pattern. Here's the demonstration. I'll give you the explanation. Let's try it out. And they may, just by looking at it, they may know right away that that's going to aggravate what they're dealing with. So we'll avoid it. Where, like, say, for example, somebody's coming in and it just happened a couple of weeks ago. Guy wants to do a little bit of jiu-jitsu, but he's concerned about his back. And the reason that he sought out private training versus group setting training is because he was concerned about who he may be partnered up with, and somebody that he doesn't know puts him in a precarious position and potentially aggravates that injury that he's dealing with. So we were able to still get on the mat and still do some jiu-jitsu, but understanding that he's dealing with a certain component of his body that's not responding the way he, is once or was once used to, then the intensity or the amount of pressure or the weight that I would put on him would be very different. So we can still work through the movement pattern, but without the risk, or at least mitigating the risk of aggravating that injury any worse.
Yeah, because you're not going to have 0% on a risk on something like that.
Right.
Would you also work with them to, like you're saying, if somebody has a weak, we'll say glutes or quads, do you also, you do the technical stuff, but are you also doing other things to help strengthen that so they can do the technical stuff safer and maybe push themselves a little further than they think they could?
That's right. Yeah. So if there's a limitation that's been identified, we'll use the glute example. Then in that whole session, we may spend a little bit more, or put a little bit more emphasis on that one area in the conditioning phase of that session. So that way they're going to get a little bit more repetition and a little bit more attention in that one isolated area. So we would still integrate, a anaerobic threshold power piece. We would still integrate a push or a pull. We would just ensure that, the analogy that I like to use is a 70-30 analogy. So if we have an hour, we'll most likely spend 70% working on that limitation and then 30% developing or enhancing the strengths that I know that person knows that they're already good at. So that 70-30 approach is kind of how we attack it.
Yeah, I kind of like that thought because I could see it now. There's many veterans out there who probably want to get back into this again, but who have injuries, and then they may also be at that stage where, as we know, pain is a biopsychosocial, so it affects the brain and your your psychology, and they may not have that energy to get back into getting off the couch.
Right.
So I could see something that you do would kind of motivate them to get back into it again.
And that was part of the reason that I really wanted to do private training and small group training only, was to really cater and tailor it to the individual, because everybody does have a different desire, a different issue, a different goal, for example. So I wanted to be able to task tailor to that individual. That way they could come in, a little less worried about the risks of making those injuries worse, but still being able to, do what they want to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think someone might be mistaken by the title tactical athlete and think that doesn't apply to them, but it sounds from, our discussion today, there's lots of things that apply, like that are transferable when it comes to the conditioning. And even if you don't want to fight, there's things there that will help you.
Agreed.
Well, Randy, thanks for being on the show. It was great to have you.
My pleasure.
For the audience, on our next show, we're going to have Dr. Andrea Furlan, and she's going to talk about supplements and how that can help with chronic pain. So hit the subscribe and like button. For feedback about the show or for more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain COE, and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. Once again, Randy, thanks for being on the show. And to the audience, stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network.